Oh, you mean right now?
No.
I've got my printer back on Lisa last night.
So can we do that? Could
Yep.
you?
The one that has the document attached to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no problem. I'll print it tonight.
Have you got a phone charge?
Yeah, just on the, you'll see it sticking out of the floor socket. The white one. No, just plug it straight in.
No,
You got to move it over.
Yeah. I've got to find another cord.
No, just this is charged, so
In case I need it. That's all. Exactly. Yeah.
switch cords. Okay, they're coming in now.
I call Miss Cassandra Holland. Thank you. Hi, Miss Holland. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you.
That's great. Before you tell your story or give any evidence about these matters, do you promise to tell the truth to the court?
Yes, I do.
Thank you very much. Miss Holland, could you please tell the court your full name?
Cassandra Mary Holland,
And where are you currently located?
313 The Avenue Road, Lavardia, New South Wales.
Miss Holland, I think you're in a room to give evidence by AVL. You've got a support person there accompanying you, is that right?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And what's the name of that support person?
John Leask, Leask.
Is he a personal friend or a colleague there to offer you a support?
He's a personal friend and he's an SES peer support officer.
What's your current employment, Miss Holland?
I'm the primary healthcare nurse practitioner at the Clarence Correctional Centre.
And where is the Clarence Correctional Centre?
It's 20 kilometres outside of Grafton.
Is that your first experience working as a nurse in a correctional centre?
It's my second experience. I did one when I was a transitional nurse practitioner.
I'm going to ask you some questions shortly about your experience as a nurse. Before I do that, I note that you're giving evidence today because you worked as a nurse in Yuendumu for around 5 months, including during the period when Kumanjayi passed away. Is that right?
That's correct.
In terms of assisting Her Honour to understand your role, you've prepared a number of documents. The first in time, I think, is a statement of events which is attached to your interview. Do you have a copy of that with you?
Yes, I do.
Am I right, that statement of events was typed up by yourself about a week after the tragedy that happened on the 9th of November 2019?
That's correct.
And I take it that you typed that up so that it would be fresh in your memory for when you had to provide evidence, if you did, to the police.
Yes, it was more that I had to provide it to the Central Australian Health Service.
I see. And you subsequently provided it to the police when you were interviewed by them on the 12th of February 2020, is that right?
That is correct.
Have you seen a copy of the interview you did?
Yes, I have the interview with me.
Terrific. And then the final one is an affidavit that you prepared based on all that experience. It's dated the 6th of October 2022. Do you have a copy of that with you too?
Yes, I do.
Then, Ms. Hollingmott, I go back to your experience as a nurse. You graduated as a registered nurse, I think, in 1985. Is that right?
That's correct.
You've had over 40 years' experience as a nurse?
Yes.
And do I take it from the outline you've given to date that in 2015 you left work in New South Wales and in Port Macquarie and commenced to work as a nurse in more regional communities?
That's correct.
And remote areas?
Yes.
So might I start before 2015? Between 1985 and 2015, where was the bulk of your time spent as a nurse?
Till 2004, I worked in hospital situations. 1994, I'm getting confused now. After my second daughter was born, I went to work in primary health care. I've always wanted to work in the areas of most need, and what I saw in the hospitals was people coming to hospital that hadn't been properly looked after, in my view, by their general practitioners, and I wanted to go back to the source. So I went into general practice to provide what I considered, to learn how to provide better health care to patients before they actually had to present to hospital.
And in 2015, then, you were working as a registered nurse in Port Macquarie. In what clinical setting?
I was working as a nurse in the emergency department at Port Macquarie between the time when I left working in general practice, which is where I did my transitional nurse practitioner in primary health care and emergency management. I then went back was then invited to a position in Port Macquarie Rural Medical School, where I was teaching the clinical components for the medical students between years 3 and 6. It was whilst I was working at the University of New South Wales that I rejoined the Port Macquarie Hospital so that I could bring the students through the hospital easier. And it was after that I chose to go remote.
In your work up until 2015, had you been involved in the clinical care of Indigenous people?
Very few. And that was one of my reasons for wishing to do so. Port Macquarie is not a town that had a great deal of Indigenous services. The services were located in the town south at Taree and the town north at Kempsey. So we didn't have a big Indigenous population.
In your statement that you've prepared in October this year, you set out the additional qualifications that you've obtained during your career in nursing. So I won't go through them in detail because we've got a list of them, but they include, as you've mentioned, an Associate Diploma of Rural and Remote Nursing, which you completed in 2016. That was just after you left Port Macquarie, is that right?
That is correct.
And at the time of this statement, just a few days ago, you were completing a Masters of Health in Rural and Remote Nursing at the University of Southern Queensland, correct?
That is correct.
In about May 2015, you left that job in Port Macquarie, where you were working as a registered nurse and a clinical lecturer in the university in the Rural Medical School. You commenced your work in remote communities in northern New South Wales, including Winton, Longreach, Muttaburra and Hillston. Do I take it that I would draw that, how long would you spend on average in each of those communities?
Roughly 12 weeks.
After that, you travelled north and worked as a clinical nurse in remote communities in Queensland through the Cape, including Cooktown and Arakoon and others. How long would you work in those communities on average?
I worked in Cooktown for a period of 18 months, but I was seconded from Cooktown to a lovely remote Indigenous area called Laura, which is on the way up to the PDR to the Cape, and it's a very remote area.
And Arakoon and Normanton?
I was lucky enough to work up at Arakoon and gained a large amount of experience working with Indigenous people. Normanton was not so Indigenous.
How long did you work in Arakoon for?
I think it was about a year.
You say in your statement that while you were working in remote communities in Queensland, you developed an interest in and a passion for Indigenous health, and that led you to undertake your Masters. Is that right?
That is correct.
So it was really a passion that you discovered later in your nursing career after leaving New South Wales?
Correct.
In about January 2017, you travelled to the Northern Territory and began your work in different communities as a nurse there. What attracted you to a role in the Northern Territory?
It was on my way around Australia. I started in New South Wales, I went up through Queensland, I crossed over into the NT.
And did you see an advertisement, or were you recruited in a different way?
No, I was recruited through agency staff.
Did you know anybody who had worked in the Northern Territory?
No, not particularly.
Had you visited the Northern Territory prior to that time?
No, never had. No.
Did you, I withdraw that, where was the first place you worked in the Northern Territory?
I worked in Owenpelly, Gunbalanya, in Arnhem Land.
And you note in your statement, in terms of the top end, you've worked in Owenpelly and at Goulburn Island before
Yes, I worked in Goulburn Island.
How long did you work in Owenpelly?
It was probably less than 12 weeks because I was seconded to go to the island to Goulburn Island, Warrawee, whilst I was working at Owenpelly.
And how long were you in Goulburn Island for?
6 weeks.
So they were two relatively short posts, correct?
Correct.
Prior to working in Owenpelly, did you participate in any course on cultural competency?
I participated in it in New South Wales and again in Queensland. I did not do it in the Northern Territory.
Was there any orientation for you in Owenpelly?
It was an orientation to the community and to the surrounding areas and areas that were off limits.
And who was that provided by?
The office manager as well as one of the local Aboriginal people.
Did you do that over the course of a day when you arrived?
It was an afternoon.
Were you offered any sort of cultural competency training by Northern Territory Health prior to commencing your role?
No, I didn't go through the usual channels of Northern Territory Health induction. I did not have an induction into health in Northern Territory because I started off as agency. My positions from when I left Owenpelly, I came down to Epinara. When I came to Epinara, I was an agency nurse. I then from Epinara went across to Canteen Creek as an agency nurse, and I was then recruited into working with the Northern Territory government. At no stage did I go through the orientation process.
So in terms of Central Australia, Epinara is in the lower Barkly Tablelands, is that right?
Correct.
That was
and Canteen Creek.
Canteen Creek has an Aboriginal name, is that right?
Yes.
Do you know how to pronounce that?
I've drawn a blank.
Forgive me if I get this wrong. Owatilla? I might need to check.
Owatilla is Epinara.
Okay. Canteen Creek also has an Aboriginal name that we'll double check.
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay.
That's right.
They were the two communities you worked in prior to arriving in Yuendamu. Is that right?
That is correct.
How long were you in Epinara and how long in Canteen Creek?
A few weeks in Epinara, 2 years in Canteen Creek.
Did you receive any sort of orientation into either of those communities?
In Epinara, I didn't because I was joining with an agency nurse who'd barely been orientated herself. In Canteen Creek, I was orientated from the clinic manager at the time, Fiona Steele, and she introduced me to all the relevant members of community.
How big is Canteen Creek?
375 people.
Did you enjoy your time there?
Loved it.
Why was that?
It was a beautiful, warm community. I was able to do a lot with the community. I felt very invited by the community and very welcomed. We were able to run many, many programs through the school, through the strong women, through the midwifery services. It was a very warm and welcoming community, and we felt part of the community.
You left there, when you say we, do you mean the clinic staff?
The clinic staff, yes.
How many clinic staff did you have there?
2.
And am I right that you didn't do any specific training on cultural competency in the central desert areas?
That's correct. I did a lot of my cultural training through my university qualifications.
In terms of your university qualifications, was there anything that focused on the particular cultural considerations for people in the central desert areas?
No, it wasn't specific to the central desert areas. Once I went down to Yuendamu, I did a lot more research into the Walpurgis people, into their history. I think it's important to know the history of the community and their sorry times and their trauma to be able to understand where they're coming from. I understood the Walpurgis were a very different people that I ever worked with before.
In terms of your learning about that, that was through your own reading, is that correct?
That is correct. It wasn't until I went to a nurses' forum that they realised I had not actually done specific cultural training. And we had more of a cultural training during that time, but that was after 2.5 years of working for Northern Territory Health.
All right, so when was that you went to the nurses' forum and that was identified?
Not long after starting at Yuendamu.
Okay. And what sort of training did you do at that time after it was identified there was a gap there for you?
It was an extension. It still didn't discuss a lot about the Central Desert people. It wasn't done specifically. It was more talking about their customs, their laws, their relationship to the land, and building on their past traumas. But a lot of it I self-taught myself.
When did you start work in Yuendamu?
In June 2019.
And was that your first experience of working with Walpurgis people?
Correct.
What was the predominant language group spoken in Canteen Creek?
I'm not sure of the language group at this stage.
Do I take it from that you didn't learn any language while you were in Canteen Creek?
No, and I didn't feel the need to, because I didn't feel that they actually spoke in the language, except when they were in their own groups. When they addressed the clinic, English was predominantly their language.
Were interpreters ever required at Canteen Creek?
No, they were not.
In terms of your own interest in the culture, though, was there any opportunity for you to learn language outside of speaking with the community members?
It didn't happen until I went down to Yuendamu when I found that a lot of people were actually learning the language. We would have, in the clinic, we would have a picture of the human body, and where we would say liver, they had the Indigenous name for it. So when they were talking about their ailments, they would discuss, if they couldn't come up with our words, we would be able to refer them to the words that were around the clinic. And I found that very helpful.
Did you become aware of any app or electronic service that would assist with interpretation?
There was the Aboriginal interpreter service. I didn't ever had to use that, because when I was addressing patients in Yuendamu, we always had an interpreter. There was always more than one person in the room, specifically if the elder could not speak our language.
So, speak the English language.
Speak the English language.
There was always someone in the room. Do you mean by that there were yapa who would offer to interpret for nurses?
Yes, always.
Other community members who were used to do that, is that right?
Not so much community members, they were family.
So your experience was that there would be someone in the family who would come with a patient who was able to translate or interpret?
Always.
Did you, as part of any of your learning before you get to Yuendamu, become familiar with the concept of gratuitous concurrence?
No, I don't know that term.
If I try to break that down to be that sometimes some people who don't have English as a first language, particularly Aboriginal people, will be obliging and might not want to reveal that they don't understand, and so will say yes or agree to something when they don't in fact understand.
We always get it. We always have people read it back to us. If I'm talking about post-operative care of a plaster cast, I would get them to tell me what they understood about the care. Always getting them to close the full circle to ensure that they've got the understanding.
You explain in your statement that while working at Canteen Creek, you applied for and were invited to join the NT Clinical Senate. What is that?
Correct. It's a group of roughly 42 people, the senior health personnel in the territory, who get together. We have the Clinical Senate of 42 members, the executive of 7 members, of which I was part, and we would meet on a 3-monthly basis, face-to-face up in Parliament House in Darwin, where we would bring to the table a specific agenda, whether it be psychology, whether it be trauma, whether it be child care, child health, maternal health, men's health. We had a specific agenda. And in the weeks leading up to it, the Executive Senate would be the ones pulling everything together, getting all the research, and we would be feeding all the research to the Clinical Senate, so that when we came together in Parliament, we were all on the same agenda.
And you met 3 monthly. Would you then have conferences or discussions outside of that 3-month period?
The executive were in touch roughly every 2 weeks.
And could you nominate things that you wanted to be on the agenda?
Absolutely. At our first clinical minute, I was there from the start, and our first clinical meeting had Natasha Files, the Health Minister, plus the Chief Executive, Catherine Stoddart, and we literally nutted out all the most important things that we thought were problems with NT health, the things that we could actually concretely deal with. And from that moment on, we set the agenda, and occasionally things would happen and we had to change agenda. If something significant happened, we would go, okay, we're going to talk about this now. And it was the executive's job to bring all the like-minded people together, find the correct speakers, and come up with the agenda for those meetings. So it was very full on.
Are there any Aboriginal people that were part of that Senate?
Many. We had people from the community on that. We had some Aboriginal health workers. That was predominantly non-Aboriginal, but everyone present had a passion for Indigenous health.
When you say it was predominantly non-Aboriginal, how many Aboriginal people do you think contributed to the Senate in your time there?
There were 5.
Out of how many?
42.
And when did you leave at your or resign from your position on the Senate?
When I left Yulara in August last year.
So from that time you were at Canteen Creek through to the time you were in Yulara, you in effect had a direct line of communication with the Health Minister, is that right?
Correct.
And senior management within NT Health?
Correct.
Do you agree that that's a unique position for you to be able to raise concerns of nurses in community?
Absolutely, and that is something that I did regularly, and I was instrumental in being the voice from the ground.
And were there minutes kept of any meetings that the Senate holds?
Yes, there certainly were, absolutely. And we had facilitators for each meeting. It was done very professionally.
Well, I'll come to any concerns you relate about Yuendamu. You started work in Yuendamu, I think, did you say June of that year? June 2019?
That is correct.
How did you come to, what was your position in Yuendamu?
I went there to be a remote area nurse. I'd been previously a manager at Canteen Creek. I was given the opportunity to go to Yuendamu, and I thought it quite exciting.
Did you know anything about the community before you got there?
I knew who the staff were, and I knew that they looked after the Warlpiri people, and the Warlpiri people were a very different lot of people to the Central Australia, I thought where I was, the Barkly area, a very different group of people. And I learnt about Yuendamu how they were all in one area and how Yulamu were a group of people who tried to distance themselves from a lot of the problems, I think, that were going on in Yuendamu. Yulamu was a much more peaceful community.
Why did you think of it as an exciting opportunity for you to go to Yuendamu when you set out?
My whole career has been exciting.
In Yuendamu, it's the largest community health centre in the Central Desert area, is that right?
That is correct.
Did you know Luana Simons, who was the manager?
Yes, we'd met at managers' forums.
Did you enjoy working with her over the period you were there?
Yes, I did.
Did it appear to you to be a close-knit team working in the Yuendamu clinic?
It was exceptionally close-knit.
Did you regard yourself as having a positive relationship with the other people working in the clinic?
I certainly did, but to start off with, I was a definite outsider.
Why was that?
I was not from New Zealand. A lot of the staff that worked there were from New Zealand, and they were a very, very close-knit team, but it didn't take long before I really loved the team. Leaving the team was very, very hard for me.
Did you have any orientation to Yuendamu?
I did. I was taken out with Jabberson. I was taken out with Luana. I had quite a bit to do with Mary and Nola. They were lovely. And they were talking a lot about the culture. I also read a lot of books from the area.
Did you come to know, prior to, well, I would draw that, early at your time in Yuendamu, did you learn about the massacre that had occurred in the community in 1928, the Coniston massacre?
Yeah, no, I didn't, but I learned about it very soon after I arrived in Yuendamu. It is a very significant event, and it is a ghastly event in 1928. And from that moment on, I was been researching other disgusting things that have happened to the Indigenous people, as late as 1960. I also studied up on the riots they had in 2010, 2011. They were inter Yuendamu riots. I've worked in a lot of areas where factions within a community will fight together over a payback, over a stabbing, over something else. That's I come to understand that is how they deal with things. I've worked in some areas where there's been a lot of riots. The Coniston massacre is something that should be on every person's history book to understand what went on with these people. But the riots, I have to say, are part of their way of dealing with things.
Whose way of dealing with things?
The Aboriginal people.
All Aboriginal people?
I think I've come across quite a few riots in my time.
But do you mean by that all Aboriginal people across Australia, or Aboriginal people in the Territory, or who are you referring to?
No, but I've been involved in 3 different sets of riots.
Where were they?
One up in Arakoon, when the nurses were encouraged to leave community. One out in Canteen Creek, where we had 25 SWAT team police officers descend on a riot. We were also invited to leave community.
And what was the other?
Another one up in Arakoon. Arakoon had quite a few riots. And at each stage, the nurses were invited to leave community.
But do you mean to suggest by that all Aboriginal people in Australia resolve things by rioting? Absolutely not.
It's just my experience that I have witnessed 3 different sets of riots, and I would not say anything to that. That sounds very prejudicial. I'm just saying, you asked if I'd experienced riots, and yes, I have. Mostly the Indigenous people are extremely calm, but I have been exposed to riots. And I think in the context of this withdrawal, I think it's important to mention that.
Okay, well, just let's take each step at a time so that you don't anticipate what I'm coming to and answer something that you might not mean. Because you make a point of saying elsewhere in your evidence that no two communities are alike in the Northern Territory.
Correct.
You accept that. And no 2 cultures are alike. Do you agree?
I do.
And Walker people might have very different cultures and customs to Tiwi Islanders, for example. Do you accept that?
I do.
Is that something that you understood when you were working in the Northern Territory?
Yes.
Do you accept that it is important, if we're going to be respectful, to actually listen and learn from Aboriginal people in a community about what their cultural expectations are?
Yes.
Did you have a sense when you went to Yuendamu that you were an outsider working on Aboriginal land?
Yes.
And that it was therefore important to listen to the Yucca people about what the expectations they had of their Cardia staff?
Yes.
You talk about this being your first experience in Yuendamu of working with the Walpri. Apart from reading books yourself about the history of the area, did you receive any training about Walpri culture?
I did, from Mary and Nola.
You say at paragraph 29 that your experience in Yuendamu is that they, presumably you mean Walpri people, have a very strong sense of community and very strong cultural and kinship ties, more so perhaps than any of the other communities that I have worked in. How did you come to understand that?
Whenever I experience an injury or a person who is very unwell, a very large proportion of the community would be outside the clinic. There was the support from the community was huge towards the person who was injured.
Where did you live in the community in Yuendamu?
Near the police station.
Did you live on your own in a house?
Yes, I did.
And that house was provided by NT Health, is that right?
That's correct.
Did you at any time outside clinical hours socialise with the Aboriginal staff?
No, I did not.
Did you socialise with any of the other stakeholders in the community?
Only the nurses.
Did you come to meet any of the other staff members working in, for example, Purple House, for one?
No, I didn't. The only person I met was Julie Harvey, who worked for the Yuendamu Old People's Place.
Did you meet any of the teachers?
No, I didn't.
Did you meet the police?
I knew of a few of the police, but we didn't socialise together.
It appears then, from the evidence that we've heard today, that the nurses very much socialised just amongst themselves, correct?
That is correct.
Is that your experience in other communities you worked at?
Absolutely not.
Do you know why that was then in Yuendamu?
I believe when I went to Yuendamu, it was a very close-knit group. As I said, a lot of them were New Zealanders. They got on famously. They'd worked together for years. I was an outsider that had to bring myself into that group, and I found them a very warm, loving, wonderful team to work with, and really, really close-knit and really supportive. There was just no opportunity to go out and meet the community. We weren't able to go for a walk and meet people. We weren't encouraged to walk outside the clinic. We were encouraged to stay within the confines of our yard, or and not even to walk to the health service.
What do you mean you weren't able to walk in the community?
It was dangerous.
Who told you that?
Luana told me that, but also personal experience. You would get taken down by the dogs. My neighbour wouldn't leave his house unless he had a massive big stick with him. He was terrified. He was scared. He put his fear onto me by saying, "You won't walk to the clinic in the morning. I'll pick you up. We'll all go together."
Who was your neighbour?
Brian Claude.
He was another nurse who worked in the clinic. Is
Yes,
that right?
yes,
Did you ever go to
correct.
the arts centre?
I did go to the art centre once.
Nurse, I've got to tell you, I don't want to give evidence from the bar table, but I've walked around Yuendamu plenty of times and I haven't had to beat off dogs and I haven't felt frightened. So what do you think it was about your experiences that made you particularly fearful in Yuendamu?
I had a fear for my own safety in Yuendamu. It's very hard to describe, and it's a fear that I've not had in other Indigenous communities. But I certainly did not choose to walk around. The only exercise we would drive our cars out to the airstrip and walk within the airstrip confines. That was our only exercise. We didn't walk through town. None of us did.
I think you said earlier you were encouraged not to walk around. Who encouraged you not to walk around?
As I said, Luana.
Did you ever raise your concern? Well, I would draw that. How did that feel for you then? Being in the community, not feeling safe to walk around other than going to the airstrip, and not then engaging with other people living there.
As I said, it was a very different experience to one I've ever experienced before.
Do you agree that if you don't socialise with other stakeholders and with Yuppa members of the community, and you only socialise with other clinical staff, however nice they are, you can become a bit of an echo chamber for yourselves and not get another perspective?
That is correct, but don't forget that I moved to an area where there was a very close-knit team. They had their rules, they had their way of doing things. I'm not going to go out and start doing things that are very, very different. I was basically going along with what everyone else was doing.
I started to ask you this question. Did you find yourself ever at the Walukulanga Art Centre?
I went there once.
Did you ever inquire with other clinic staff as to why they didn't spend time with, for example, White Act staff or teachers?
No, I don't think the opportunity was ever there. As I said, it's very, very different to elsewhere that I've worked.
What was the opportunities, or what were the opportunities that presented themselves in other communities that weren't available in Yuendamu?
I will use Canteen Creek as an example. I spent a lot of my time in and around the community. I spent a lot of time at the school. I was invited to the school every Wednesday afternoon. I sat with the women in Strong Women's on Thursday mornings. I had a huge amount to do with community. I knew all the community by name, and I would often go and sit in the park and talk to the elderly. I would go to the park and play with the children. It was a really lovely, warm and welcoming community, and I really enjoyed working there. There were no distinctions. We spent so much time with the teachers. We spent a lot of time with the Indigenous people. I had a lovely Aboriginal health practitioner working with me. I spent time with her and her family. We've eaten together, and it was a very different experience.
Miss Holland, did you ever feel during the 5 months you were there that it was regrettable that you couldn't have that same experience in Yuendamu?
No, I wouldn't say it was regrettable.
Why not? Why would you not want to be socialising with other stakeholders? Why would you not want to be playing in the park with children from Yuendamu? Why would you not want to be mixing with the Yuppa community members?
As I said, I didn't feel welcome to.
But isn't that regrettable?
I'm not going to. No, I don't believe it is regrettable. I'm sorry that it wasn't as much a rewarding experience as it could have been. My rewarding experiences came from the work that I was doing within the clinic, but it didn't extend outside.
I appreciate it didn't, but is there some reason why you are reluctant to just acknowledge now that it's a shame to not be able to mix with other stakeholders and Yuppa community members, to get to know them outside the clinic in a way that it would make that a more rewarding, happy experience?
I did not feel welcome to do that.
And is that something that you ever raised with Luana, the manager?
No, I didn't. I just went along with what everybody else did.
Do you think that was a missed opportunity, looking back on it?
Actually, I don't think so, no.
So if you had your time again, you wouldn't try to do anything different in terms of getting to know the community?
No, I don't believe I would.
In your time in Yuendamu, you came to know that there had been some break-ins at a period of time of people's houses.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
I'll just read to you from your statement from October this year. In the period leading up to the withdrawal of the health staff on the 9th of November 2019, there were a number of break-ins and break-in attempts at the clinic accommodation within Yuendamu. Some of them occurred while staff were at the clinic, others occurred when staff were within the unit being broken into. Is that correct, that information?
That is correct.
Nurse, we've heard evidence that apart from an incident in 2018 that some of the nurses come to know about, there were no occasions that I'm aware of where somebody actually entered into the home of a nurse. Is that your understanding?
That's correct.
So when you... I'll just ask you an open question then. Prior to November 2019, what were the incidents you were aware of where somebody had actually entered into nurses' accommodation?
We had incidences regarding Julie Harvey. She was a nurse from the Yuendamu Old People's Place. She had been repeatedly broken into and she was concerned for the safety of her daughter. We also, there was a historical break-in of Robin Carmichael, and the other one that was very close to us was Chrissy Marfleet. Her and her husband Stuart, they were repeatedly broken into, and he's a person who's a paraplegic, and they stole his wheelchair.
Was that in 2019?
That's correct.
So you yourself had not been broken into, is that right?
That is correct.
In terms of those incidents that you referred to, Julie Harvey told you about them, is that right?
That is correct.
And then you heard about the incident with Robin in 2018?
That's correct.
And then there was the Chrissy Marfleet incident in 2019, or you told us about learning about what had happened in her house. Were on any of those occasions, were the people physically harmed?
No, they were not. I can't comment on Robin Carmichael. I only heard about her after the event. I wasn't there at the time.
I see. You only heard about her after November 2019, is that right?
That's correct.
So
I only heard about her. No, I heard about her when I started in June.
All right. If I could tell you that the police report suggests that happened in 2018 and she was not physically harmed, I'm not downplaying that. I'm just telling you what the facts are. Is that what you understand? That
is, and that's what I've come to know.
Nevertheless, were you concerned prior to November 2019 that it was possible that some members of the community might break into a house owned by or living in that nurses were living in?
Absolutely. The first day I started at Yuendamu, I had a discussion with Luana Simmons, and she told us that everything of value needed to be locked up in the safe in the clinic and to not leave anything of value in our houses while we were at work.
Did she say anything to you about the possibility of a break-in at night while you were actually there?
We were advised to lock the perimeters of our house and definitely to lock up all the doors in our house and the windows.
And did you feel safe when you did that at night time?
I did feel safe. I put a concern in that we had Perspex windows that could have easily been pushed in, and ironically we had CrimSafe on only half of our windows.
When you say you put a concern in, who did you put a concern into?
I put it into Luana and I also put it into management.
Did anything happen in relation to that?
No.
You speak about the ColourBond fences you had. You had the same ColourBond tall fences while you were there, is that right?
That is correct.
Did they give you concern in relation to security?
Yes, because the ColourBond went the wrong way. They were a wonderful ladder.
Had anybody from the community ever use them as a ladder?
Not into my yard. I had one incident where I know that someone was in my yard overnight, but my neighbour, if he'd forgotten to take his cigarette butts in, he would come out and went, "Damn, I forgot to take the butts in. The kids were over here again."
Did you have a sense then that in terms of being in your neighbour's yard, it was young people looking or kids looking for cigarettes rather than anybody trying to break into the house?
Yes, that was my impression.
Did you ever raise any security concerns with the Senate, given you had a direct access to the Health Minister?
I did. I did comment on the standard of housing. I commented on the fact that at every moment of the day we're at risk of being taken out by dogs. The dogs are in plague proportions throughout most Indigenous communities. Those type of things from the ground up, they were very important. And also just the dangers of walking into a community, walking around a community, and how safe it was to access the health staff at night time.
Can I just ask you to be careful with your words? You just said there that the dogs are in plague proportions in most Indigenous communities. Was that your experience in Canteen Creek?
There were a lot of dogs in Canteen Creek.
All
They
right.
had to be culled frequently by the vets.
You didn't walk around with a stick fearful that dogs would bite you in Canteen Creek?
I have been bitten twice by dogs in Canteen Creek. I've been taken down by dogs in Canteen Creek.
Do you say that you formally raised your concerns with the former Northern Territory Minister for Health about your personal safety in Aboriginal communities?
It was often a discussion at the Senate. Natasha Files was not in the Senate room at all times. It was a generalised comment, and admittedly, one time I was at Senate and I'd recently had a dog attack, and it was a topic of conversation.
Did you ask for anything to be done about it?
We did. In Canteen Creek, we had the vets come out.
What about when in the 5 months at Yuendamu? Did you ever make a specific request, I'm starting with the Senate, that something be done to assist nurses with security?
Not specifically, no.
What about of your management team, Luana or above her? Did you ask that anything be specifically done?
It was we certainly discussed the security of our houses. That was a constant concern, and the fact that we didn't have proper windows in our houses, and we had perspex that could be pushed in. The houses were not secure, and that was very frequently discussed.
How was that discussed?
I put in an IMS regarding it as an incident management system. I'd spoken directly whilst I was down at conferences, and I'd spoken to Luana.
And was anything done in relation to those concerns that you raised during your 5 months there?
Nothing was done.
So, a number of things have occurred to us in court while we listened to security concerns, and one example of an improvement may be the installation of cameras in houses. Was that ever discussed?
No, it was never discussed.
What about the installation of an alarm for houses? Was that ever
It was never
discussed?
discussed.
What about a personal alarm for nursing staff?
That was never discussed.
Do you think any of those things would be of assistance to improving a sense of security and actually improving security?
I don't believe it would. Thank you for the question. An alarm is only so good as the immediate police response, and the immediate police response in a community can take quite a while. It's not like we're walking around Darwin with a personal alarm, or we have an alarm go off at our house.
Your Honour, sorry to interrupt, just if it assists. There is quite a bit of material before you in the brief currently, but in terms of looking at devices such as this, it's in the affidavit of Tina Fleming.
Great,
It's
thank
dated
you.
31 August. Thank you.
Did you ever have to call the police in relation to any security concern
Whereabout?
in Yuendamu?
No, I did not.
At paragraph 36 of your October statement, you talk about this period leading up to the withdrawal of health staff on the 9th of November, where you refer to a number of break-ins and break-in attempts at clinic accommodation. Did you discuss that yourself with any of your Aboriginal staff members?
It was discussed at the morning meetings, and the Aboriginal staff members were present at times. Not always, but they were there at times.
Was there ever any discussion prior to November 2019 about what could be done to assist nursing staff with security concerns?
We put applications into town to get our houses fixed. That was something that I know is concrete.
Were you ever part of a discussion as to how the Aboriginal community could be engaged to assist nursing staff?
No, I was not part of those discussions.
Did you ever raise that suggestion?
No, I did not.
Why not?
I was a newbie there. I was a new person at the clinic. I was not there for that length of time. These things had already been done by Luana and ongoing by Luana. She was the clinic manager.
When you say these things had already been done, what are you meaning there?
Community engagement, discussing with the community the concerns of the staff, particularly with the break-ins. Luana was in charge of community liaison. She had a lot to do with the Indigenous health workers that we had there, and she was very involved with the community.
Why did you think these things had already been done in terms of liaising with the community?
Because Luana told us.
On the night, I withdraw that, on the 6th of November, that was a Wednesday, Luana's house was broken into. When did you find out about that?
On the morning of the 9th.
On the night of, Luana went into town after that to get car windows fixed that had been smashed. When did you find out about that?
On the morning of the 9th.
On the night of Thursday, the 8th of November, or the early hours of the morning, I should say, Matilda received a phone call from her colleague to say that she was concerned about houses being broken into. That is, Miss Watts called Matilda and told her that she was concerned about a house being broken into. When did you find out about that?
9 o'clock on the morning of the 9th.
So what happened on 9 o'clock on the morning of the 9th?
I went into the clinic as I was taking over call. I contacted Vanessa because I expected her to be at the clinic. And when I spoke to Vanessa, she gave me the rundown of what had been going on.
What did Vanessa, that's Vanessa Watts, is that right?
That's correct.
What did Vanessa tell you?
She told us that there'd been break-ins into the houses overnight, and that the clinic staff had police called at about 1:30 in the morning. They were terrified most of the night, and they sat up for quite some time talking, and they'd all had very little sleep.
Did she actually use the words they were terrified most of the night?
She said they were scared. They were huddled together. I definitely got the impression that there was a lot of fear going on.
Now, did you consider that there was an escalation of what had been occurring in the community?
Very definitely, because the nurses were at home at the time of the break-ins.
All right. And that was very unusual, wasn't it, for there to be an actual attempt to enter a house while the nurses were home?
Except in 2018 with Robin Carmichael.
Okay. Well, given that the last one was 2018 with Robin Carmichael and we're now November 2019, it was not a regular occurrence, was it?
That is correct, but when Chrissy Marfleet had one of her home break-ins, her husband, who was paralysed, was in the bed listening to people ransack his house. He was in the house yelling at them. Given
that conversation that you had with Vanessa Watts, did you form a view as to what should occur next?
I informed Vanessa that I would have to speak with management, so I escalated it as we do all of our concerns through management.
At paragraph 38 of your statement, you say, I was also aware that the Northern Territory Police were having ongoing issues with Kumanjayi Walker and others in the days prior to the 9th of November 2019. Firstly, when did you become aware of that?
It was a conversation through the clinic. It was not a direct conversation from the police, but it was a conversation that we were having at morning meetings.
When you say we were having, who was having that conversation?
The nurses were aware.
And they were aware of that prior to the 9th of November, is that right?
That is correct.
Who was leading that discussion?
It would have been Luana, but it was an escalation of events that were happening, and it was made aware to us that a particular person had recently escaped from custody, and since he arrived in community, there'd been an escalation of break-ins.
And that particular person, I won't use his first name, but that particular person you now know is Kumanjayi, is that right?
That's correct.
And had you ever met that person prior to the
Yes, I have.
discussions?
Yes, I have.
How had you come to meet Kumanjayi?
He was brought into the clinic one night when I was on call. He came in under a different name. He came in with a WIDAC worker who encouraged him to use a different name. He was pretty cut up. He had broken into the WIDAC rooms and he'd been ransacking the rooms looking for food, and they managed to calm him down and feed him. He was then brought to the clinic for care. And it was later that I realised that I actually had Kumanjayi in that room.
What was the name of that WIDAC worker who came in with him?
I'm not sure. I do remember her roughly about 35, blonde hair.
Do you? That was the only time that you had any dealings with Kumanjayi, is that right?
That is correct.
When you were speaking with nursing staff prior to the 9th of November about Kumanjayi coming back into the community, what was said about him?
That the police were looking for him and that we should be aware. And it wasn't until they started talking about it that I realised that I had actually met him.
Why were you being told to be aware of Kumanjayi?
The increasing break-ins.
This is what you say at paragraph 38. I was also aware that Northern Territory Police were having ongoing issues with Kumanjayi Walker and others in the days prior to the 9th of November 2019. On the 9th of November 2019, I had a conversation with Julie Frost where she expressed concerns about Kumanjayi's behaviour towards the police. When did you have a conversation with Julie Frost?
I had a conversation with Julie Frost on the day of the 9th when I was locking up the ambulances at 11 a.m.
I see. Was that after a decision was made to leave the community?
That is correct.
I'll come to that shortly then. Going back to the conversation that you had earlier with Vanessa Watts, you note that Luana was not in the community because she was in Alice Springs having the car repaired. You just found out about that from Vanessa, correct?
Yes.
Vanessa told you she had called the police to report the incident overnight, correct?
That's correct.
You also record at paragraph 44 that 20 minutes after she called, the police arrived, the persons escaped over the fence, the police found shovels, pickaxes and multiple tools in the yard. Is that something that Vanessa told you about?
Yes, it is.
And Vanessa told you that the rear window of a staff personal car had been smashed?
She didn't mention that. I saw that when I arrived there.
Did Vanessa tell you that Tilly was in the last of the units and that she had been woken up by the noises outside her unit?
Yes, she spoke to me that herself, Janine and Tilly had, I think the words were, huddled together in Janine's house for quite a period of time after it. They were certainly frightened.
Nurse, the evidence is that in fact Vanessa woke Tilly up when she called her at 1:15 to tell her what she was hearing. Is it possible that that's what you were told?
No, I was told that after the police had called that Tilly and Janine, they were all got together after that because they didn't go outside until the police arrived, but Tilly was woken up by a phone call from Vanessa.
You offered to remain first on call rather than hand over to Vanessa, is that right?
That's correct. I made the offer because Vanessa had had very little sleep, and I made the offer saying that I'm happy to take first on call, and then if you want to have a sleep and take over later, that's fine.
Shortly after you got off the phone call to Vanessa, you called the on-call coordinator, Janine Bridge, and described the night's events, correct?
That's correct.
Why did you do that?
That is what we do. We have to do that. We have to report any events. So I reported it through to Janine that there'd been a significant incident, and she informed me that she would need to escalate that to the manager on call.
You explained that you didn't want to tell Luana because she was already stressed. Or I withdraw that. You told her that those concerned didn't want to tell Luana because she was stressed?
That's correct.
And Janine advised that she needed to notify the senior staff member on call, Helen Gill, correct?
That's correct.
You then received a phone call from Helen Gill.
Yes,
What did she say?
I told Helen the events that had happened overnight, exactly the same. I also said that Vanessa specifically did not want Luana notified.
Helen requested Luana's number because she said she had to have a discussion with her in relation to the events, correct?
That's correct.
Did she ask you to do anything in relation to what had occurred?
Yes, I had a patient with me in the clinic, so I couldn't action it immediately. John Alting had come into the clinic, which was often his habit to do on a weekend, to do some work. So John and myself were working in the clinic, and we were taking care of the needs of our patient. So it was an elder, plus there were 2 other elders with her. I was informed by Helen Gill that I needed to close the clinic, go over to the nurses' houses and discuss how the nurses were feeling. I also advised her that there were 3 patients in the clinic, and she said they will need to be notified that the clinic will be closing.
Did she tell you why the clinic would be closing? Why that decision had been made?
Because I needed to close the clinic so that I could go over and speak to the nurses.
I see. So at that stage she was saying close the clinic temporarily so that you could go and speak to the nurses to see how they were feeling. Is that right?
That's correct. The clinic was closed on weekends. We only opened it for emergencies.
Okay. Luana then rang and told you specifically to inform people within the community that the nurses were likely to be leaving the community due to the break-ins. Is that right?
That's correct.
What did you think about that?
She wanted me to go and tell everybody that the nurses would be leaving and why. She made the comment, the nurses would be leaving because the community had done nothing to stop the break-ins.
Did she sound angry?
She did.
What did you think of her request at that stage to you to tell the community that the nurses would be leaving?
I did as Helen Gill asked. I closed up the clinic. I saw to the needs of this patient. I specifically remember giving the patient and all the people with them any of their medications. So that was the start of my giving out the medications in community, because that was a concern. So I gave them all their medications and anything that they'd need, got them sorted. And then John and I closed the clinic and we drove over to Janine's house, and that's where we started our first meeting.
Okay, I'll ask you about that shortly. But had you ever, in your time in the Northern Territory, worked in a community where the clinic had been closed for a period in response to violence or break-ins or any action in the community?
As I mentioned, the clinic was closed because it's not open on the weekend.
Sure. In terms of I'm referring really to the temporary closure of the services offered by the clinic. Had you ever been in a community in the Northern Territory, to start with, where there had been a temporary closure of the clinic in response to something going on?
Yes, I did.
What was
up
that?
In Arakuni.
Okay. Was there a protocol that was followed when that occurred?
Yes, there was.
In those circumstances, did the clinic staff leave the community?
No, they did not.
In this circumstance, you thought that you'd have to speak to nurses before there was a final decision as to whether or not the services would be withdrawn, correct?
That's correct. And keep in mind that I wasn't the one that was traumatised.
How did you feel, though, at that stage after speaking to Luana when she was angry?
I just said to Luana that I was taking the phone over so that each of the nurses could in turn tell Helen Gill their story, because it wasn't mine to tell.
Did you feel at that stage frustrated with community that there had been these break-ins?
No, I didn't feel frustrated.
Did you feel angry that there had been the break-ins?
I felt concerned for the nurses.
Did you also feel angry that there had been the break-ins?
No.
You note in your statement at paragraph 49 that at that stage you informed some of the persons in the clinic who you were treating, including an elder, that it was possible that some or all of the clinic staff would be withdrawing from the community.
Yes, because they overheard my conversation. They were in the same room as I was when I was talking to Helen Gill.
Do you recall now the name of the elder who was there?
No, I don't. I'm sorry.
You say in your statement that the elder said she would pass the information on to other elders in the community.
That's correct.
What information would she pass on?
That the nurses were having a meeting because of more break-ins and the nurses felt frightened.
You say you recall the elder was understanding of the reasons why clinic staff might be required to depart and acknowledged
Very definitely. There was no animosity. It was a discussion.
Did you give consideration then to ways to engage the elders, including that elder you were with, to help the nurses so they would not have to leave the community?
No, I didn't. My job was to follow orders, and my orders were given to me, and I carried out those orders.
After you'd finished with the patient at the clinic, you and John attended Janine's house to meet with the rest of the staff who were in the community. And you nominate various people who were there. Julie Cook, Lisa Meredith arrived. Was Tilly at that meeting?
Tilly was there with Janine and Janine's partner, and Vanessa. They were the 4 people that were there when I arrived.
And then Julie Cook and Lisa Meredith arrived.
That's correct.
Lisa told you that the previous night she'd heard children on her roof.
They were pulling the iron off her roof.
She'd heard children on her roof, that it sounded like they were pulling the iron roofing up and trying to break into her accommodation, correct?
That's correct.
And Julie had seen a number of children in John's yard and his window, and she had yelled at them, telling them to leave.
Yes, correct.
That was very different to anything you'd ever experienced in Yuendamu, is that right?
That is correct.
You spoke to Kumanjayi Walker, Janine's husband, and you thought he'd have a good understanding of who should be spoken to inform them if some of the clinic staff were to be withdrawn. He suggested Jimmy Langdon and Eddie Robertson, correct?
That's correct.
Did you know those people?
Yes, I did.
How did you come to know Eddie Robertson?
I'd cared for him at the clinic.
And Jimmy Langdon?
I'd cared for him at the clinic.
Did you give consideration at that stage to, rather than telling those people that the clinic staff might leave, actually consulting them as to what could be done to help nursing staff to prevent
That
leaving?
wasn't my job. My job was to follow orders.
You note that Jabberson Williams arrived at that stage at Janine's house. Did Jabberson come into the home?
No, Jabberson stayed in his car. Vanessa and I walked over and spoke to Jabberson.
Did anybody invite Jabberson into the house?
No, I don't think he particularly wanted to come into the house. He was just quite... It's not a common thing to come into other people's houses.
Do you think it might, just thinking back on it, do you think it might be a good way to break down some barriers? That if you're a Cardia staff member, to invite your Yappa colleague into your home to have a cup of tea?
No, one of the things the first thing I learned in the Northern Territory is that we have boundaries, and our front fence is our boundary.
Do you mean boundaries with your Yappa staff members?
No, I mean with community.
Okay, I'm talking about your fellow clinic staff. Here was Jamison. He arrived at Janine's house. He's in a car. Why didn't you or anybody else invite him into the house to chat with the other nurses?
It wasn't my house. We were having a discussion with Jamison, and the frequency of having a discussion with someone through a car window is very common.
If it was your house, would you have invited him in?
No, I have boundaries.
All right. At that stage, Jabberson arrived. There was a discussion. Jabberson, it was explained, but you say both Vanessa and I explained to him that management was considering whether or not staff should be withdrawn from the community because of concerns around the break-ins. What did Jabberson say?
He was just very understanding. Jabberson was a man of very few words.
How would you know if he
He
was...
He heard the rumours, yeah.
How do you think you would know if, in fact, Jabberson was hurt that nursing staff were leaving, that he felt disrespected that nursing staff didn't ask him his opinion. How would you know that?
I didn't know that because I didn't know Jabberson well. I left that conversation to Vanessa Watt. She had a long history with him.
Was Vanessa standing beside you?
She was giving the whole dialogue.
Did Vanessa ask Jabberson how he felt about the decision?
That's irrelevant. I didn't have that conversation with Jabberson.
But
I was aware that Vanessa was talking to Jabberson.
Did you hear what Vanessa was saying to Jabberson?
What Vanessa was telling Jabberson was that there were more break-ins and they were in discussion with management about taking the nurses out.
Did Vanessa ask Jabberson what he thought about that?
To my recollection, no.
Do you think she should have?
To my recollection, no.
But what about, put your recollection to one side, what about your feelings? What do you think, Miss Holland? I'm not jumping on it. This was Vanessa's conversation. Vanessa had been in the community a lot longer than I had, and she knew the locals. All right. If you'd been in the community longer and you knew some of the local people and you'd worked with Jabberson for a longer period of time than 5 months, let's say you'd worked with him for 4 years, would you ask him what he thought of the nursing staff leaving the community?
I would have had a longer conversation with Jabberson if I'd been there for a longer period of time. I still felt like an outsider in Yuendamu.
Okay. I'm going to put you on notice of this right now. I anticipate that I will submit to Her Honour that nursing staff should have asked the Yucca Clinic staff what they thought about Cardia staff members leaving the community and whether anything else could have been done. What do you think about that in hindsight now?
In hindsight,
Yeah.
the value of hindsight, I think a lot more discussion between, I'm going to say town, the Central Australian Health Service. I believe they should have come to the community and taken over and worked with the police and worked with the community. I don't believe that between the hours of 9 and 11 to withdraw the clinic staff was appropriate.
Why? So just following on from that, why do you not think that was appropriate?
I've worked in a lot of clinics where the nurses have been under threat and they've been given options to leave. I've never been one of those nurses to ever leave a community.
Why not?
I don't believe any community should be left without health services. And I've worked between 2 clinics where there hasn't been an on-site, but there's always been someone in control. And my concern is that Yuendamu had a lot of sick people.
So rather than withdraw their health staff, you think that management should have arranged for alternative health staff to come in? Is that your evidence?
No, I believe that management should have come to Yuendamu on that day and supported the staff.
Okay. Supported the staff to stay in the community, look after the residents, work with community to try and resolve the issues. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct, because the management were encouraging the nurses to make a definite decision.
Did you feel that put the nurses in a very difficult position with the community?
Very definitely, very definitely.
You note, I'll finish up shortly, Ms. Holland, so that my colleagues can ask you some questions before we finish, but you note that you and John, your fellow nurse, drove to Jimmy Langdon's house to inform him of the potential withdrawal, but he wasn't there. You informed Jimmy's family of the potential withdrawal, correct?
Yes, I said we were advised by management to tell as many people in community that it looked like the nurses were going to leave. And at that stage, going around town, I had a lot of people put their hand up for medication. I went back to the clinic, got their medication, and spent quite a considerable time delivering medication.
Were you concerned, though, that if you left that day, there would be a significant number in the community who you had not yet reached with their medication?
Absolutely.
Did you express that concern to management?
Yes, I expressed many concerns to management.
Who did you talk to on that day about the difficulty with some members of the community accessing medication?
I had a very strong discussion with Fiona Cameron and Helen Gill about leaving the clinic, leaving the community, just leaving the community total. It went against everything that I've ever learnt.
Was there any sort of risk assessment that you're aware of that occurred before the decision was made for nurses to leave?
I'm not aware of any.
Do you agree, from what you've said earlier, that before a decision as drastic as removing the staff, there should be a risk assessment for the rest of the community?
I would like to think so.
You then note that you and John searched for Eddie Robertson but couldn't find him immediately. You came across 2 police officers who were attending from Nirrupi, and you told them that it was likely that the nurses would be withdrawn from community as a result of the break-in.
That's correct.
You and John then returned to the meeting at Janine's house, where everyone was given the opportunity to say whether they felt safe remaining or wished to leave. And that was the second half of the meeting when Helen Gill and Luana phoned in. Do you recall who led that discussion?
Helen Gill.
And you said everybody was given the opportunity to say whether they felt safe remaining or wished to leave. What did you say?
I said I did not feel unsafe and I wished to stay in community.
And what was the response?
I was told in no uncertain terms that I had no choice.
And who were you told that by?
Helen Gill.
Did anybody else who was at that meeting express a desire to stay?
John was not keen to leave. Vanessa was half-hearted. I'd have to say the majority of the nurses, there was no one at at that meeting that said, I have to go now.
Given you were such a close-knit team, did you not think that you could push back on the decision at that time?
We weren't given that opportunity by staff. By this stage, 5 members of community had already decided that they would agree to leave, and I'm saying agree to leave. They'd raised their concerns with management, and the comment from management was saying basically that you've raised this concern with us, we're offering you to leave. And it wasn't a pleasant, you've already raised this concern to us, you're telling us you're scared, we're telling you can leave. That was the conversation.
And that was the conversation being directed by Helen Gill, is that right?
Helen Gill and Luana, we had 2 phones going.
And what was the tone of the conversation?
It was not an irate group. It was a group that were tired, and they were each looking at each other saying, are we going to leave? That type of thing. There certainly wasn't, not one of them put their hands up and said, get me out of here real quick.
All right. It sounds like from what you've just said, though, Helen Gill said words to the effect of, you've told us about the break-ins, you explained your concerns, we're offering you the opportunity to leave, but she put that decision-making back on the group of clinic staff. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. And then did some members...
Sorry, can I just interrupt? And there wasn't any alternative in relation to how the issues might be resolved in a different way?
No, we were given no alternative. There was no alternative to say if we stayed would we be made more secure. That wasn't entered into.
And did anybody raise an alternative, Miss Holland? Did anybody say, well, let's first talk to the police about what safety measures can be involved, or let's first talk to the community about what we can do about it?
No, that wasn't my job. The job was done by management, and management made that decision.
Sure, but I'm just asking you about, did anybody in that meeting raise an alternative?
No.
And you're disappointed that management did not raise an alternative scenario, is that right?
I am disappointed, yes.
At any of the communities you've worked at before or since, when there has been a temporary clinic closure because of some activity in the community, has there been, well, I would draw that, I think that you've told us earlier the staff have actually remained in the community, correct?
Correct.
And have any of those temporary closures been caused by break-ins to houses?
More so fighting.
After that meeting where Helen Gill and Luana were present, was a firm decision made that the nursing staff would leave?
Yes.
Did anyone in particular in that group want to leave?
They agreed to leave.
Do you think, looking back on it, Ms. Holland, just trying to learn from what occurred, there was a bit of group think going on rather than
There
any...
was.
Yeah.
There was, definitely. They were supporting each other.
But nobody was trying to think independently about alternatives to leaving. It was either stay or leave.
That's correct.
And one of the lessons I'm going to suggest to you is that there should be a clear understanding set out in a policy that everybody understands as to what alternatives there are to ensure that people can stay safely.
Yes, that would be good.
You note in your statement, partway through that meeting, you left the conversation because you got a phone call from Robbie Robertson. Was that on
Yes, I did.
Was that on your personal mobile or your clinic mobile?
No, definitely not. That was on the clinic phone.
All right. And he was very upset. He spoke loudly over the phone.
He was very angry.
Did you know Robbie Robertson prior to receiving that call?
Yes, I did.
Was it in your experience unusual for him to be angry like that?
No, not in my experience, but the concern was it wasn't just Robbie on the phone. There were a lot of people behind him, and it was a very abusive, very aggressive phone call. It was not a calm phone call. It was very loud and very aggressive.
Were you aware prior to receiving that phone call that there was a funeral planned for that?
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Did you appreciate at that time in November the significance of funeral and sorry business for Warlpiri people?
Absolutely.
And did you respect that?
Absolutely.
So when Robbie Robertson called, he was upset, wasn't he, about the possibility of the disruption to the funeral if the nurses left?
Yes, and I spent quite a deal of time trying to get Robbie to calm down so that I could discuss this with him. The phone call escalated to the extent that I had to disconnect the phone. Robbie then called me back and apologised for yelling, and we then had a very calm discussion about the fact that the health staff would not be leaving until 2 o'clock when he had access to that body. This is where I confirmed with him the time of the funeral. It would be between 2 and 2:30, and I guaranteed him that we would be there to organise to help him with that. There was no animosity.
In terms of the first of the phone call you had where you hung up on him...
Oh, it was dreadful.
Did you raise your voice in response to him?
Yes, I tried to get a word in edgewise.
Correct. Do you think, looking back on it, that you may well have been rude in that conversation?
Oh, very rude, I'm sorry, and very disrespectful, but I was in the heat of the moment and I was trying to deal with staff who were leaving, and I was trying to deal with management, and I was in the middle of having a very abusive phone call.
All right. Were you stressed, Ms. Holland?
Oh, absolutely.
Well, we've heard evidence this morning from one of the other nurses who overheard that phone call, and a number of the nurses had concerns with the tone that you were using in the phone call.
Yes, she only heard one side of the phone call,
All right.
and she heard me trying to get a word in to Robbie, saying, I can't hear you, you're not listening to me. And I think I said, you're not listening to me, and that's probably a very incorrect thing to say in hindsight, but I was trying to get him to calm down.
Okay. I'm not saying this to you, Ms. Holland, as any personal criticism. I appreciate you've told us you were stressed and you've acknowledged that you were rude on the phone. Is there anything you want to say about that? I want to tell you, people might be listening in Yuendamu and they might appreciate your reflections on it.
They will know that that's not my normal tone, and I'm a very easy person to get along with, but I was in extenuating circumstances and I was being screamed at down the phone.
All right. Do you regret, however, raising your own voice in response to Robbie?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Because you can appreciate, can't you, from his perspective, how distressing it might have been thinking the nurses were going to leave right just before they needed access to the loved one's body.
That's right, and that's why we had a follow-up phone call.
During the follow-up phone call, you then made arrangements where you told Robbie that you would provide access to the morgue at 2 p.m. prior to your departure.
Yes, that's correct. I guaranteed it.
after the phone call from Robbie, you received a call from Helen or Fiona Cameron, who said all staff within the community were required to depart Yuendamu and return to Alice Springs. You say during the conversation, I withdraw that. Can you tell us, by Helen you mean Helen Gill, correct?
That's correct.
And who was Fiona Cameron?
Fiona Cameron was senior to Helen Gill.
Did you at any time during that phone call express to them your concern about leaving the community?
By that stage, they'd already made the decision, so it was not my call to make. I was discussing with them the fact that I'd been asked by the family specifically that I would not leave. I think I gave a directive to Helen Gill. I said, I'm not leaving until after the funeral starts.
You note that despite your reservations, you took steps to prepare for the departure, and shortly after your call with Helen, you contacted Julie Frost, Sergeant Frost, to request permission to park the first ambulance and your Land Cruiser in the police station. You did that, and then you offered to provide Julie with the keys to the ambulance, but Julie said she didn't want them. You recall that?
Yes, I do.
What was your intent in offering Julie the keys to the ambulance?
Well, I would have said words into the effect of, do you need me to leave? Would you prefer I left the keys to the ambulance with you, knowing that the Yuendamu staff would have their own ambulance, but we would be delivering the keys to the clinic. And I specifically was concerned enough to offer to leave the keys to the ambulance with Julie.
Did you tell Julie at all that you had concerns that you were withdrawing?
Oh, absolutely.
And
we had a very honest discussion.
Julie asked you, indicated to you, didn't she, that she would prefer you not to leave?
Yes, that's correct.
Did she specifically ask you not to leave?
No, she didn't ask us. She said, I can understand why you're leaving.
But she made it clear to you she did not think it was a good idea for you to leave clinic staff?
She didn't make that no, she didn't. She said, I'm sorry that you're leaving. I understand the nurses are concerned. We couldn't help them. We can't keep you safe.
I need to say to you, Miss Holland, that Sergeant Frost has given evidence in these proceedings, and it was put to her that she had that conversation with you, and that I asked her whether or not she might have said, I fully understand why you all have to leave. We can't keep you safe. And her evidence is that she does not recall having that conversation with you.
That is the conversation I had with you.
Sorry, she doesn't recall those specific words being part of the conversation.
Is it possible, Miss Holland, that you had some conversation with her, but she did not say the words, we can't keep you safe?
She certainly had said words a lot. She could understand why the nurses were scared and why the nurses were leaving. She was very understanding of it. At no time did she ask me not to leave. That wouldn't have been my place to answer that.
She certainly made it clear to you that she did not want you to leave. How did she do that?
By saying that she was very sorry that we were leaving.
You indicated paragraph 63, this is what you say, I recall that Julie indicated that she would prefer that we did not leave.
That's correct.
How did she
indicate? She definitely did not want us to leave. I'm sorry you're leaving. I'm sorry that you've got to leave.
Did you say to her, well, is there another way we could do it? Is there any alternative?
No, I did not. I did not. The decision had been made. Not my job.
Do you think that rather than leave the community, every effort should have been made by NT Health to liaise with stakeholders like police to see if there was an alternative?
That's management's job. I wasn't in the position of being a manager.
But Ms. Holland, you are a nurse of over 40 years' experience. I'm just asking for your opinion so we can learn from this tragedy. Do you think...
I would have very much so liked to see NT Health arrive on site and help to mediate the situation, because leaving the community was not something that I was comfortable with.
Do you still feel... I would draw that. Do you feel angry that nurses left the community on that day?
No. It was up to them.
It was up to who?
As a group, they decided that they would accept the recommendation to leave.
Who made a recommendation?
I'm not angry about the fact that they left. It was a decision that wasn't made by me.
You mean, you just said recommendation to leave. Who made a recommendation to leave?
Helen Gill gave an authority to leave.
It was
It wasn't a request. I was demanded to leave community
by Helen Gill.
by Helen Gill and senior management.
There was no recommendation by senior management to leave, though. There was an authority to leave. Is that correct?
To start with, there was a recommendation. They put forward an offer that the nurses would be cared for accommodated in Alice Springs should they choose to leave. That was the first conversation. The follow-up conversation was one out, all out, and I had no opportunity but to leave. I held back as much as I could, but I had phone calls going left, right and centre, and after 2:00, when I contacted Robbie regarding the funeral, I was told then that the funeral would be put later, and I had to liaise with management. Management just kept saying, you need to leave now.
So when you spoke to Robbie again, he told you that the funeral wouldn't commence until 4:30. You told Robbie that the clinic staff needed to leave before 4:30? And that,
yes, it was a very calm conversation.
And you and Robbie agreed to meet at the basketball court, and you did that, correct?
That's correct.
What time did you meet him at the basketball court?
It's before 3, it was about 2:30, would have been about 2:30.
You explained that you would unlock the morgue and prop the door open with a rock, correct?
Absolutely. I drove over to the morgue. He drove over to the morgue with a group of people in the vehicle that they would be using. I explained, we went through it together, and I said, you will have absolute access. I had already printed off a document that was to be given to be read out at the funeral, just as I would do normally. The only difference is that the body wasn't removed at the time of opening it. So we had all the gates open. We had the morgue propped open with a rock. We didn't leave it wide open so that they had full access. And then I explained to them all how to turn off the generator, how to lock the morgue, and it was very respectful.
During that conversation with Robbie, a staff member from Waidak approached you and began yelling at you and suggested that the departure of nurses showed a lack of respect for the family of the deceased.
That wasn't during that conversation. That conversation happened when I was leaving the community and I had to go past the basketball courts. I stopped at the basketball courts because our health practitioners were wanting to talk. I had another brief conversation with them, but that's when the volume went up. There was a lot of screaming about how the nurses were being disrespectful. We weren't the ones screaming at the funeral.
Did you think, I would draw that, did you know the Waidak staff member you were speaking with?
Yes, she's the person that I met on the night that I looked after Kumanjayi Walker.
Have you had any discussion with her since this occasion?
No, I haven't been back to you and Damu.
Did you at the time try to explain why the nurses were leaving?
No, I was having a conversation with the clinic staff. She wasn't invited into that conversation.
Were any Aboriginal people there when you were having that heated discussion with the Waidak staff member?
Yes, quite a few started walking over towards the ambulance.
Were any Aboriginal people distressed?
The distress was coming from the Waidak worker. And she was leading the chant that I wasn't allowed to take the ambulance out of community.
The Waidak worker was clearly indicating that her view was that the departure of the nurses was a lack of respect for the family of the deceased who were about to, or who were participating in the funeral, correct?
That's exactly what she said.
Okay. Could you understand that viewpoint being expressed?
I didn't think she had the right to say what she said. It wasn't coming from the family. It wasn't coming from the respectable people that were at the funeral. It was a very solemn occasion.
You didn't have any relationship with anybody from Waidak? No friendship or professional relationship, is that right?
The only person I knew from Waidak was Stewie.
Do you think that, looking back on this incident, there's a real lesson here about the value in stakeholders developing relationships so that you can try and work?
That's very definite. That is, and that's a management position.
What do you mean by management position?
That's a decision that would be made by Luana.
Right. So
I was there as a remote area nurse. I wasn't part of it.
But if you were part of management again in your career, would you make an effort in a remote community to try and bring the stakeholders together to develop those relationships?
Absolutely, as I've done in the past.
Okay, so if you've got an issue to work through like this, you can draw on the collegiality and assistance of each other.
Yes, because I'd know who to talk to, and I would have been part of previous meetings.
You note in your, I don't need to take you through this, but at about 3 p.m, you and Vanessa departed the community for Alice Springs. In fact, you dropped the keys to the staff at Yullamu on the way home. Is that right?
That is correct.
Did you speak with the two nurses there?
Yes, they were elderly nurses.
And did you know them?
No, I did not.
When you spoke with them, did you explain to them that nursing staff from Yullamu were leaving?
Yes, absolutely.
Did
They had
not-
already had this conversation from town.
Did they express a view to you as to that?
The comment was, we're not going anywhere near there.
Who said that?
One of the nurses.
Do you know which nurse that was?
No, I do not.
Did you say anything in response?
I said that that the nurses had to leave because of the break-ins, and we'd been directed by town to leave the community, and that we had to hand the keys to the clinic over to Yuendamu.
When the nurse said we're not going anywhere near there, what was the tone of that?
We're not going anywhere near there. There's fighting going on. We're not going anywhere near there. We don't want to go anywhere near there. Yullamu is a very, very calm, very peaceful place.
Did it concern you when you saw the nurses, you described them as elderly, did it concern you that they may not be fully equipped to cater for the large population group in Yuendamu if there was a medical emergency?
Absolutely. They wouldn't know the people. It was when you're a remote area nurse, you choose the areas that you're going to go to. When you are over the age of 65 going on for 70, you don't choose to work in areas where there is a huge burden on you for call-outs, all that type of thing. You choose a more sedate community.
But also in terms of the numbers, Yuendamu is a community of around 900 to 1,000 people, fluctuating. But
That's correct.
It means, doesn't it, that you could be dealing with a number of emergency call-outs over an evening. Is that right?
That's a very common occurrence.
Okay. So if you had, you could have, for example, somebody having a heart attack and someone having an asthma attack, correct?
Absolutely. That was relatively common.
And so you must have been concerned as you were driving into Alice Springs that the community of Yuendamu was not properly protected in terms of dealing with an emergency?
Absolutely.
In the days, or you came to learn on that evening as a result of a phone call from Sergeant Frost that there had been a shooting in the community and emergency care was required. That's
correct. It was just as I was handing the phone over to Luana that phone call took place. I answered the phone because I had yet to pass it over to Luana. I literally just walked into the meeting area. I took the phone from Luana. I took the phone from Julie, where she said that there'd been a shooting. Where are the keys to the ambulance? And I handed it straight to Luana.
That was the end of your involvement that evening, is that right?
That is correct.
You haven't been back to the community since that time, is that right?
I was allowed to go back only providing nobody saw me go back because I had to pack up my house.
But you haven't returned to the clinic to work?
I've not been allowed to, no.
Why is that?
I was held accountable for the actions of leaving the community.
When you say you're held accountable, by whom?
I'm going to say by... This is a difficult one for me because following the removal from community, we gathered together at the Peter Sitzler building, which is the remote area place. We had a big discussion about the nurses going back into community. This was the second day after it. We had a very big roundtable meeting that was attended by all of the people that were removed from Yuendamu, as well as senior management. And the discussion was that they'd been out and they'd had a big discussion with the elders about the nurses leaving community and the reasons why and how it was done. And we all went around the room. We all agreed to go back to community. I didn't have any reservations about going back to community. At the end of the meeting, I was advised that I needed to stay behind. I was escorted to an office where I was left to sit for 25 minutes before I was approached by Dave Reeve and Kelly Brahm, and I was informed that I was not allowed to go back to community because of the way we left community. So I was blamed.
Do you feel that you were blamed by NT Health Management or blamed by the community or both?
I believe I was used as a scapegoat.
By whom?
David Reeve.
Have you expressed that view to NT Health?
Yes, I have.
All right. Have you received any counselling or comfort as a result?
No, I received no counselling. I wasn't allowed to go back to Yuendamu the following day, where they had a large contingent of health personnel. The chief nurse arrived. She had no idea when I spoke to her later that I'd even been involved.
It sounds to me, Ms. Holland, that you feel very hurt as a result of that. Is that right?
Yes, I am.
And that you have your own trauma as a result of this, correct?
I have trauma after the fact that a 19-year-old died in community and there was no health response, and I'm very hurt by the way I was treated by Northern Territory Health.
Have you participated in any form of root cause analysis or lessons learnt discussion?
I wasn't involved. I was shunned.
Would you have liked to have participated with your colleagues in an analysis of what happened to see what could be learnt?
I would like to have been allowed to go back to community with my colleagues and get healing.
I'll finish soon, Ms. Holland, but in relation to that issue of trauma and healing, you've come to know, haven't you, that many members of the community in Yuendamu have experienced generations of trauma?
Yes, I am.
And that they can be re-traumatised by events like the one that occurred in 2012 with some rioting that affected the community?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And then, of course, there's re-traumatisation from the tragedy of Kumanjayi's death and the way in which he died.
Yes.
Do you agree?
Yes, yes.
Do you think that there is an urgent need for trauma counselling to be available within the community of Yuendamu on an ongoing basis?
Very definitely.
Thank you, Ms. Holland. Those are my questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just so you know, there are a number of other lawyers here representing various parties, and they've got a few questions for you as well, Ms. Holland.
No problem at all.
Your Honour, might I just check with the witness that she doesn't need a break? I appreciate the time.
No, I'm fine.
Some of the old blokes at the bar table might need a break.
We normally have a 15-minute break now. We'll stick to 15 minutes. We will just take short breaks. I know that you'll find we've got a large number of people and other people might need a break as well.
Not a problem.
15-minute break. We'll see you soon.
All stand. Coronial Court now stands temporarily adjourned.